Yamunatiravanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajaka Ashotara Sata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajaka Ashotara Sata Shri Srimad Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai. Nam Acharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnav Vrinda Ki Jai. Prem Se Kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. All glorious to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glorious to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, 12th chapter, titled Creation of the Kumaras and Others. Today we'll be going through texts 36, 37, and 38. So what I'll do is I'll recite the verse and translation for 36 and 37. Then we'll do 38 together, because it's the main one that I will be speaking on. Vidura uvāca savai viśva-sṛjām īśaḥ vedādīn mukhato sṛjat yad yenāsṛjad devas tanme brūhi tapo-dhana. With whose help Brahmā established Vedic knowledge, which emanated from his mouth. Maitreya said, beginning from the front face of Brahmā, gradually the four Vedas, Rik, Yajur, Sama, and Atharva became manifest. Thereafter, Vedic hymns which had not been pronounced before, priestly rituals, the subject matter of recitation, and transcendental activities were all established one after another. Text number 38. Ayuhu vedam dhanuhu vedam gandharvam vedam atmanaha stapatyam cha asṛjat vedam kramat purva adibhihi mukhaihi ayurvedam dhanurvedam ayurvedam dhanurvedam gandharvam vedam atmanaha gandharvam vedam atmanaha stapatyam chāsṛjad vedam stapatyam chāsṛjad vedam kramat purvādibhir mukhai kramat purvādibhir mukhai ayurvedam dhanurvedam gandharvam vedam atmanaha stapatyam chāsṛjad vedam kramat purvādibhir mukhai ayurvedam dhanurvedam gandharvam vedam atmanaha stapatyam chāsṛjad vedam kramat purvādibhir mukhai. Please chant. Ayurvedam dhanurvedam gandharvam vedam atmanaha stapatyam chāsṛjad vedam kramat purvādibhir mukhai ayurvedam dhanurvedam tapatyam chāsṛjad vedam ayurvedam dhanurvedam vedam atmanaha Ayurvedam dhanurvedam Gandharvam vedamatmanaha Vadibir mukhaihi Ayurvedam dhanurvedam Gandharvam vedamatmanaha Satyam cha sṛjat vedam Ayurvedam dhanurvedam Gandharvam vedamatmanaha Satyam cha sṛjat vedam Matajis. Ayurvedam dhanurvedam Gandharvam vedamatmanaha Cha sṛjat vedam Vadibir mukhaihi Ayurvedam dhanurvedam Sarvam vedamatmanaha Vadibir mukhaihi Ayurvedam dhanurvedam Mukhaihi Ayuhu Vedam medical science Dhanuhu Vedam military science Gandharvam musical art Vedam they are all Vedic knowledge Atmanaha of his own Stapatyam architectural Cha also asṛjat created Vedam knowledge Kramat respectively Purva Adibihi beginning from the front face Mukhaihi by the mouths. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation. He also created the medical science, military art, musical art, and architectural science, all from the Vedas. They all emanated one after another, beginning from the front face. Purport. The Vedas contain perfect knowledge, which includes all kinds of knowledge necessary for the human society, not only on this particular planet, but on other planets as well. It is understood that military art is also necessary knowledge for the upkeep of social order, as is the art of music. All these groups of knowledge are called upa-purana, or supplements of the Vedas. Spiritual knowledge is the main topic of the Vedas, but to help human beings' spiritual pursuit of knowledge, the other information, as mentioned above, forms necessary branches of the Vedic knowledge. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvetam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanshana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanshakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vikasa Swaminiti Namine Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Sarasvate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavari Paschatya Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Ayurvedam Dhanurvedam Gandharvam Vedam Atmanaha Stapatyam Chāsṛjad Vedam Kramat Purvadibir Mukhaihi. He also created the medical science, military art, musical art, and architectural science, all from the Vedas. They all emanated one after another, beginning from the front face. This is continuing the secondary creation, this visarga of Lord Brahmā. A lot of different aspects have been described, but first we can see for all of the general living beings before populating the earth and the rest of the universe so much, Brahmā wanted to create all of this very important knowledge. Previously we were talking about the information and knowledge in the Vedas for things like sacrifice, and the different paraphernalia for this types of austerities, this yagyas, the four principles of religiosity, and this Vedic knowledge to help one follow those different principles. And here, while seemingly not very spiritual, we have created medical science, military art, musical art, and architectural sciences. So I'll start this class off with a story. I know everybody likes stories. Don't interrupt me if you've heard this one before. It's a pretty popular one. Once upon a time, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then that nothingness, somehow or other, by some sort of miracle, it seems, it exploded. This thing that was nothing, it exploded. And it exploded, and when it exploded, it turned into a soup. Has anybody here ever had soup before? Everybody, I'm sure, right? So this explosion, it turned into a soup. And then this soup, gradually, it formed into single-cell organisms. Because the ingredients for all of this soup, it randomly combined together by some chance, randomly. It combined into single-cell organisms. And then these single-cell organisms, from somewhere, they got some sort of, not necessarily intelligence, but some sort of drive to form together, probably just from some combination of chemicals or something like that. And when they formed together, they created multicelled organisms. And then these multicelled organisms, they continued to expand. And then they created the first, I guess what we could normally as like visible life, which I guess they say was some sort of like plankton or something like that. This is how the story goes. I'm just telling the story. And then these very simple organisms, because we're so advanced now, so everything had to start very, very simple. All these very simple things, they gradually, by chance, again, because nothing happened for any sort of way or reason, it all just happened by chance. By chance, these very simple organisms, they started to do what is called evolution. And evolution, it's almost like magic, you could say, but it can't be magic because magic's not real. These organisms began to advance, and over time, these sea creatures, they began to be able to go on the land. And then from the land, which was already there, nothing was living on it though, everything was in the water. But on this land, there was all this varieties of all this different stuff, like maybe fruits and trees and all this kind of stuff. And then they thought, wow, it would be nice if we could have some of these things that are in the trees. So gradually they grew legs, and then they were eating everything that they could reach. But when they couldn't reach something else, they were just like, wow, this is just so unfortunate. But then they had a genius idea where previously a lot of animals had 4 legs, but by standing on their back 2 legs, they could reach up and grab fruits that previously couldn't have been reached. So then gradually they began to develop more intelligence. Then we see things like monkeys. Who's here ever seen a monkey, like in person? Most of those who have been to India, or I guess a zoo doesn't really count, because zoo animals are like, it's like you don't really get like the real thing, So then these monkeys, they developed more and more intelligence. Then eventually one of these monkeys became Charles Darwin, who, I don't know if anybody has ever heard of him before. He's like the main character of this story. But he's probably the most intelligent human being of all human history, because he's the one who actually came up with this beautiful story. He's the one who first told this story, which almost seems like a fairy tale, but it can't be because fairy tales aren't real. And then gradually, we have the present civilization that we have today, where everything before us had happened completely by chance. But luckily for us, we had the great causeless mercy of Charles Darwin to be able to explain to us this wonderful story by which we can perfectly understand everything without any sort of questions or any sort of thoughts like, oh, maybe like something else happened. But this all makes perfect sense, right? Or no? So this is the story that I'm sure many of us have been told growing up. Because we went to this prison camp of indoctrination known as school, where school, it's supposed to teach you how to become intelligent, teach you how to learn things like morals, things like science, things like history, so you can be sort of a well-rounded human being. And without school, we'd all just turn into barbarians, right? Like, I mean, have you met those people that haven't gone to school? But really, we see that before going to school, children, they actually ask very intelligent questions. Like, I don't know, where did all this come from? Where did I come from? Where does this intelligence come from? Is this real? Is this real? Is that real? And even kids, they can sort of think that, okay, how did all of this come from absolutely nothing, right? I see that everything around me, it comes from some sort of thing, even like the things around me. I ask my parents, where did this food come from? Oh, I got it from the store. Oh, where did this come from? Where does the light come from? Everything they say, it comes from something. But they say that, but all of it originally, it came from absolutely nothing. And it then turned into a soup, right? So even kids, they can sort of think that, okay, this doesn't really make so much sense. But luckily for them, they can go to school and they can learn how to, don't ask those questions. Those aren't the kind of questions you should be asking. And they they get this indoctrinal education by which they are taught all of these different dogmatic points, dogmatic things, and they stop to question everything because they're so busy studying to get good grades on their tests so they can go to a good university, so they can get a good job. And by getting a good job, they can be a good citizen, basically just like a blind idiot who just listens to absolutely everything that the government tells them. So in this way, the school is perfectly training everybody to be blind, useless idiots. And then that way, the people who have some sort of power, they can easily control people. Because when you don't think about anything, when you don't use this thing that we all have, it's called intelligence. When we don't use our intelligence, people can just manipulate us any which way that we want. And this is what the modern society, the modern school system, it indoctrinates people to be. Just basically internalize a certain part of information and then take a test on it where you basically just regurgitate that information. You don't even have to know how it applies to your real life or how you can use this information. You just have to almost like systematically memorize it and then just spew out that same information. And then as soon as you spew it out, you just forget all of it because then you don't really need it anymore because you already passed the test. And then you just keep doing this over and over and over again where you spend all of your time on this sort of indulging and then regurgitation process. But we can see that even though they're presenting what is known as knowledge, right? In school, you trust that this person that I'm learning from, what they're giving me is knowledge. What they're giving me is the truth. What they're giving me is scientific, right? We all went to science class. And in science class, we learned a whole bunch of different experiments and formulas and different processes. And we accepted it all as fact. But if we went back even maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or we asked our parents what we learned in school, I don't know if this ever happened to any of you, but a couple times when my parents tried to help me with my homework, they were like, wait, like this isn't what I learned. It was like completely different. So we're learning some truth that was completely different than the truth that our parents previously learned, which was completely different from the truth that their parents previously learned. So we can see that what is going on as truth in current society, it's actually just relative truth, meaning it's the knowledge that we can gather based off of our own understanding, or based off of what we can make sense of without having to really like dive too deep into everything. But we can see that Srila Prabhupada says here in his purport that the Vedas contain perfect knowledge. Right? In this story that I told previously, if you look back to when at least for when the scientists say that the Vedas originally came into, written form about 5,000 years ago, everyone else on this whole planet, except maybe like the Europeans, were complete savages. They didn't have any real tools. They didn't have any proper knowledge. They didn't have any proper developed language. They were just sort of going on. Some were like hunters and gatherers because they had the intelligence that they could hunt and eat animals and that they could produce some sort of agriculture. But that was basically the highest extent of their intelligence. And the Europeans who, surprise, surprise, happened to write all of our history books, all of our textbooks, all of the current quote-unquote knowledge that we have, luckily, when they got to travel to all these uncivilized lands, they got to civilize them, and they got to give them their higher knowledge. At least this is what is currently taught as our modern history. But really, if one even thinks a little intelligently, this medical science, military art, musical art, and architectural science are actually very, very advanced. But if you look in the current history classes, when they cover this topic, when they cover this subject matter, they don't really go into detail about these different sciences, these different complexities. They just teach what's known as like the Indo-Aryan migration theory, where it basically describes all this stuff that I had just mentioned, where it was very uncivilized and we went there. I don't know if that's the exact name, but it's something like that, Indo-something migration theory. But we can see that this Sanskrit language, with which all of the Vedas are composed in, it's actually the most complex language that we have access to even today. Even after our so-called advancement, even after all of our scientific theories, even after becoming so sophisticated, we can't come up with a more sophisticated, complex, and descriptive language than Sanskrit. And Sanskrit, it's a lot different than all of these other languages, and for those who study linguistics, it's particularly unique in its composition, where every single concept, every single word, it comes from a root. And all of these words, they're composed in a very systematic way, and one word can have such in-depth and complex meaning. Like, you just think about the word karma. It's just 5 letters that are put together, but to explain what karma actually means, you could probably write a whole book just explaining what this concept of karma means. And we can see that not only did they have such complex, just practical language, but with this language, they were actually able to create and describe in depth all that we have here. First is described that this medical science was created, which is popularly known now as Ayurveda. And if we look actually deep into Ayurveda, they had a lot of knowledge which we only just recently discovered. And this whole idea of discovering this knowledge, it's kind of funny if you think about it, actually. Like, we famously hear about how Christopher Columbus discovered America. Because, previously the Europeans didn't know about it, so that means it practically didn't exist. So he discovered America because he was the first European, at least from that part of the world, to have gone there. So similarly, all these different things that we've discovered, it's really just wholesale cheating, because you aren't really discovering anything. It's like we have this phrase, you reinvent the wheel, right? Where it's like every single time you just make some like slight adjustment, or you paint it like a different color, and you say, look, I've created some brand new thing. So this is the cheating that they're doing in the name of discovering. But there's this ideology that's pushed that everything important that we have now, it came from the European civilization. Why? Because they want to be the center of everything. They didn't want to admit that there was anything more intelligent than them out there. So when they went to India and they saw all this in-depth knowledge, like in the Ayurveda, it describes the same bones that the scientists, after all their X-rays and diagrams and all this, have spent so long discovering. They have the same artery and vein structure that we've spent so much time studying in depth. And if you look at Ayurveda, it for pretty much every single ailment, every single bodily problem, there's some sort of solution. You can take this herb and this, you can combine these things together and you can cure this. But apparently at the time that this knowledge was present, these people, they couldn't even communicate properly with each other. They were just complete savages. Same with this military art in the Veda, which literally means the science of archery, but it's more than just archery. It basically covers a whole array of military sciences, like when we hear in Bhagavad Gita and in the Mahabharata how all of the armies, they were arranged in certain formations, and like how when the warriors, they surrounded Abhimanyu to fight him, they arranged in a sort of military pattern. All of these things, they're from the Veda, and it has different like fire weapons, water weapons, all of these different things, which even nowadays we don't have so much access to. Same with this musical art. It's known as the Gandharva Veda, actually. All these different ragas and these different melodies, it's so complex. Like current musical instruments can't really even come close to what we see. And even if you see something like an orchestra or a symphony where there's so many complexities that are going on, it's actually not even close to the in-depth and the science behind this Gandharva Veda, because it described not only the different musical tones, like these different ragas, but how every raga has a different mood, and how just by this specific singing, by these certain sounds, you can heal different things of the mind, so many different things. It's all elaborately described here in that Gandharva Veda. And amazingly enough, the Vedic architectural science is one of the most in-depth, and they actually discovered so many things by this architectural science and the science of astronomy in the Vedas that only recently the quote-unquote modern science has discovered. Like in Vedic astronomy, there's the concept of pi. They actually valued pi because to calculate astronomy, you have to use circles because things run in orbit, so you have to use pi. And that same value that in Europe they only discovered, I think it was maybe like 600, 700 years ago, was already there in the Vedic knowledge. Same with the Pythagorean theorem. I don't know if anybody remembers this from school, but a squared plus b squared equals c squared, where you have a triangle, and to calculate the hypotenuse of the triangle, you use this formula. The same formula is actually there in this Vedic architectural science. But Pythagoras apparently discovered it. But really, it was already there in the Vedic knowledge. Same with even things because remember, we're talking about architectural science, and if you look at this Vedic architecture, for those who have been to India and have got to see these ancient temples with all their intricacies and how everything's designed with all these archways, they even have descriptions of like quadratic equations, which is like basically if you have a parabola or something in the shape of an arch, you can calculate like the exact basically, like by changing around the numbers, you can expand the arch, decrease it, move it up, down, all of this kind of stuff. So they had all of this ancient architectural science, and it was very, very advanced, and it was very, very descriptive. I don't know how many of you guys have been to my mom's house in Alachua, but that was actually designed, my father designed it himself, having no previous background in architecture or anything like that, by actually studying the Vastu, Vedic science of architecture. And he was drawing up all these plans by himself. And I remember some mornings he would be there on the table drawing, and I would just be like looking at it, and it was for like the house that we were going to be living in, so I would just like say, oh, can we have this here? Can we have this here? And then he was like, no, because this has to be like exactly 25 inches and 3/4, and if I extend this here, then I have to do all this, and no, because there has to be a window here, because there's another window here, and the light has to be able to pass through. So all of this super in-depth science is actually present here in the Vedas, and it's so in-depth and it's so descriptive, but we don't really get taught about it. We don't really learn any of this stuff anymore because primarily they don't want to admit that previously people were more advanced. People had more not only intellectual but technological advances. And why is that? Because it would throw off their whole theory. It would throw off this whole story that I told before, where basically the theory is that now we're the most advanced that we've ever been. But if you look around, what is our so-called advancement? What is it? We found so many new ways to what? Pollute the earth? To poison all of our food? Right? We like hear about all these so-called advances in like food canning sciences and freezing and preserving. But all this is doing is putting more and more chemicals into the food and poisoning it. And all of this new philosophy about lesbians, gays, transgenders, all of this is the most advanced, so-called, that we've ever been, right? Because it follows this Darwinian science about how previously we were just simple celled organisms, and now we're gradually advancing to be the most advanced that we've ever been. But if you accept the Vedic knowledge and you actually use your intelligence, like I actually looked into a lot of these things before knowing that I was going to be speaking on this verse, because when I was in Niagara Falls, I was sort of looking at the history behind it, just sort of thinking like, was this always all there? And they say that 12,000 years ago, basically all of America, it was covered in like a big sheet of ice that was about 2 kilometers thick. And then when the earth started to warm again, that ice started to melt and the water started to trickle down, and gradually when all of the ice melted, the water had formed this big gorge. So I was just sort of looking into all this history and asking all these questions, and they were like, yeah, there was people there at the time, but they were just like simple savages. And then I was like, okay, what do they say about India? And they say the same thing. And then I started to like ask all these questions, and basically the conclusion that my research came to was that the scientists just blatantly ignore this because it would contradict their current theories, and then they wouldn't know what to say. So they just blatantly ignore all of this advancement. But the point that Srila Prabhupada is making here is that even though it's so advanced, even though this knowledge is so in-depth because, it was given by Krishna himself to Lord Brahmā, it's actually simply just a supplement of the real knowledge, which is this, what we have as Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam. In Bhagavad Gita, I was just reading the other day that Srila Prabhupada says in his introduction to Bhagavad Gita, which is actually, so amazing. I've read it before so many times, but I'm reading it again, and I'm just thinking like, wow, like when I was on the Beltline yesterday, I was just meditating on the fact that, I'm actually able to give people access to this same knowledge that I'm reading. And it's just it's like mind-blowing, actually, what Srila Prabhupada describes in his introduction to Bhagavad Gita. But he's describing that this Bhagavad Gita, it's actually the essence of all of the Vedic knowledge. And how everything that we have from the Vedas, all of this knowledge, it's been completely summarized and given by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. And we can see that by our own attempt of knowledge, our own attempt of understanding, the best thing that we've been able to come up with is this Darwin's theory, which is basically useless. So one who's actually intelligent, they'll be able to accept that with my own imperfect senses, with my own imperfect knowledge, I'm not able to understand the complete truth. And science, it sort of goes on in this big charade because they do teach things that are true. Like you learn that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. That's true. That's a true statement. Or you learn that when you combine hydrogen with 2 oxygens, you get water, and you get H2O. And you can scientifically prove it with all these equations. And you have all of these different things. Like I studied in a medical profession, so I learned all of these different things, and you could practically see, like, you would give this certain drug and this exact thing would happen. It was very scientific. But they bring in all this truth and they surround it in a big cloud of ignorance. Because they say, oh yeah, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell membranes are made from the Golgi apparatus, yada, yada, yada. But they say that, but all of this, it was originally first from outside of the cell. And then when they gained some intelligence, they formed this single-celled organism. So even though there's some truth there, it's such imperfect knowledge. Because even if you have such a complex mathematical equation, and you get all the points of that equation right, if in one part of your equation you put 2 + 2 = 5, the whole thing is going to be wrong, because one of your most fundamental principles is incorrect. So even though they have access to so much knowledge, so much information, ultimately, all of it's completely useless because they're teaching it on the principle that all of this came from matter, all this came from chemicals, all this came from absolutely nothing. And we can see that the Vedic knowledge specifically is described that Bhagavad Gita, it gives us complete knowledge. It gives us knowledge of the absolute truth. And in Srila Prabhupada's introduction to Bhagavad Gita, he says that absolute truth, the complete absolute truth, it consists of 5 different principles. It consists of full complete knowledge and understanding of the jiva, of Ishvara, of prakriti, of kala, time, and of karma. And full understanding of these 5 things consists of the absolute truth. Because when one understands these 5 points, one is actually able to understand everything around them, everything about them. They might not be able to identify, how many bones are within the body, but Bhagavad Gita teaches us that we're not this body. So, while for some people it might be important for them, for those who study to be doctors and everything like this, it's not important for everybody to know the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, all this stuff that we're taught in school. The most important thing to know is these 5 principles. And Srila Prabhupada very greatly summarizes this in this introduction to the Bhagavad Gita here. And when I first read this, I had to read it like 5 or 6 times because it's like pretty deep if you really think about it. Srila Prabhupada says, there is complete facility for these small complete units, namely the living entities, to realize the complete, and all sorts of incompleteness are experienced due to incomplete knowledge of the complete. So Bhagavad Gita contains complete knowledge of Vedic wisdom. So we can see that, and as Srila Prabhupada describes, that the living entities, they're getting their same consciousness from the source of that consciousness. Because for one who is actually using their intelligence, they can see that everything around us, it comes from a source. So our consciousness, it's also coming from that supreme consciousness. So within our consciousness, we have the same tendencies of that consciousness, which Srila Prabhupada describes, which is where we also get this idea where we want to control, where we want to enjoy. We actually get this propensity because we're coming from that same source of consciousness, which is Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And on our own, we're very small. The jiva, it's actually described that jiva and prakriti, they're in the same category, in which that they're both subject to the control of the whole material nature. And if we actually look about it, we may be controllers to some extent. I can control if I put my hand on my head, I can control what I'm saying, but there's a supreme controller. If we see there's so many things that are out of our control, how are they going on? Because there's a supreme controller, there's a supreme personality of Godhead, which all of these things are coming from. So this jiva and this prakriti, they have the capacity to be under the control of the material nature. But the Ishvara, Krishna, he controls the material nature. So there's no question about him coming under the control of this material nature. So we can see that even though we're trying to understand the complete, if we're looking at the complete through our own incompleteness, then we'll have an incomplete understanding of that complete person. Which is why we have to get the complete knowledge of the absolute truth through the Bhagavad Gita. Because it's very significant in that Krishna himself, he came and he spoke this Vedic knowledge. 5,000 years ago, Krishna came and as he says himself, that he comes to establish these religious principles when this yoga nashta, when this dispersion of the proper knowledge happens. Krishna himself comes and he comes to give the proper knowledge. So the supreme complete, the supreme personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna himself, he came and he gave us this complete knowledge. And if you actually go through Bhagavad Gita and you analyze all of the points, we can see that this complete knowledge of absolute truth is given to us. And if we simply understand this Vedic knowledge, then there's no question of anything else, right? We meet so many people, they have so many crazy ideas. Like, I was in Toronto on the streets with Giri Prabhu, and this one guy, he walked up to me and was like, "Hey, I know that book, Bhagavad Gita, it's pretty good." And I was like, "Yeah, man, you should take a set of these books, we got a whole bunch more." He was like, "Let me ask you something. Have you realized yet that you are God?" And I was like, I realize that I'm a servant of God, or at least I'm trying to. And he's like, "Oh, see, you're still at so much of a low-level understanding. You haven't even realized you're God yet." And I was like, "Okay, so you really think that you're God?" And we were going through a whole back and forth. I was trying to help or try to have him understand it intellectually, but it wasn't really getting through. And it sort of came to a crescendo, yeah. And I was like, "Oh yeah, you think you're God? Then what is my name?" And he was like, "Well, I haven't given you a name yet." And I was like, I still have a name. If you're God, if you're really the supreme, all-knowing, supreme controller, then you should be able to tell me what my own name is. Because I know what it is. And if I know what it is and you don't know what it is, then you cannot be God. And then he went, "What religion are you representing?" And I said, "The Krishna consciousness movement." And he said, oh, I see. And then he just walked away. Because we can actually see one who has proper knowledge, they won't come to all these crazy ideas that I'm God, you are God, the chair is God, the dog is God. But we can see that we can properly understand how Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead. And we can get full practical knowledge about this. And we can actually become proper Vedantists. We can actually realize the actual essence of Krishna's teachings and the teachings of the Vedas by not just sitting, studying, and reading all day, but Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, "One is most dear to me for one who shares this amazing Vedic knowledge that I've given to other people." So one can actually be a proper Vedantist, one can be fully realized in the Vedic knowledge by giving this Vedic knowledge to everybody else. So one who wants to actually realize the conclusion of the Vedas, they will want to give this Vedic knowledge to everybody else, which is why Srila Prabhupada, he wrote these books. Well, he said that Krishna wrote these books, actually. He even read his own books. And Srila Prabhupada, he perfectly presented everything in his books where no one can come to the conclusion that, "Oh, I am God," or "Oh, everything is just coming from nothing." Srila Prabhupada perfectly addresses all of these points. For one who actually reads through Srila Prabhupada's books, they'll get complete and pure understanding. I know it's time, but I'll finish with one thing. When I was in Toronto, I met this just random karmi guy on the street. He had all, how Indians, they wear those red thread things? He was wearing those, but he was a white dude. So I was like, dude, this guy must be something special. And he was like, "Wow, is that Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Srila Prabhupada saved my life." He actually got introduced through astrology. His astrologer was a Vaishnav astrologer, and he was going through this difficult period in his astrology, and he was like, "What do I do?" So his astrologer was like, "The best thing for you to do is to read the Srimad Bhagavatam." Literally. And he was like, "Okay, might as well." So he got Srila Prabhupada's Srimad Bhagavatam, and he read the whole thing. And what he told me was, "I appreciate so much what you're doing, because this man, Srila Prabhupada, in his books, there's no fluff. There's no other ideas. He just presents everything perfectly as it is." Srila Prabhupada's books, one can even just read one book and get full, complete understanding. And this was just some dude that I met on the street. He wasn't going to the temple. He wasn't a devotee. He was just some guy that was interested in astrology that read the whole Srimad Bhagavatam. And he was like, "What you're doing by giving people these books, they don't even know that one of these books could change their whole life." And he was like, "This Srila Prabhupada is the most important man in history because he gave us these books. Thank you so much for sharing these books with everybody." So we can see that one who's actually realized in the Vedas, one doesn't have to study all of the medical sciences, the military art, architectural science. One just simply has to read and distribute Srila Prabhupada's books. That's it. And through that, one will get the perfect Vedic understanding. So, sorry I sort of rambled on for some time about scientists and everything like that. I sort of felt inspired by my inner Rishi Kumar. But if there's any questions, comments, or corrections, we can discuss that now. Giri Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
When we were in Toronto today, we can visibly see the atheism was oozing out of everywhere. And these atheists, they propagate this atheism like it's a religion also, honestly. And when this comes about, like, you know, LGBTQ and drugs and, you know, all these different things come about because of atheism. They're propagating atheism so much. And like you were saying, they don't want their theories, they like undermine the Vedic literature, and they just completely are biased. And, you know, I had one experience there in Toronto as well, that same day that you met there. Like,
Powerful dude.
I was talking to two gentlemen, and they're like, one guy was like kind of Christian, at least he said he was, but like he wasn't really actually. But they were just complete atheists. And I started speaking about, like, at first they were like, yeah, you know, what you're saying is making sense, because I was speaking on a like logical level, so they can understand. And then like, I started talking about like, you know, let's look at facts. And then like, I started talking about like, you know, the reason, you know, why these scientists are like ruining the world is because, you know, they're trying to make solutions, material solutions to modern day like material problems. And I was like, it's not gonna work. And I gave the example of like the horse in the car. Like when I gave that example, they were just like, no, actually, that's like, you can't use that example. I'm like, okay, like I can use other examples. It's like not just that one. There's so many examples of like how scientists are trying to create modern material solutions with material problems that's just not possible. And like they just got completely like fried out because they're just completely biased, and like you said, they're just completely indoctrinated into one way of thinking. That's it. Like, you know, even though the guy was Christian, he was still on the scientist side. He believed in evolutionary theories. Like, it doesn't make any sense at all. And it's like when I started speaking about these facts, they just like they didn't know what to say. They're like, okay, I'm done, and they just like walked away.
Yeah, and we can see this is why the Vedic knowledge is the topmost, because it gives knowledge about all these different points and all of these different ideas. Like I was hearing one lecture the other day by His Holiness Bhakti Vikas Maharaj, and he was because there's this whole modern conundrum, right? We hear this big philosophical question of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? But actually in the Srimad Bhagavatam, it's described that the first offspring that was created by Kashyapa, I think, was the birds. So that perfectly answers that. Kashyapa, he created all of the birds, and then the birds, they had offspring in the form of eggs. Boom, answers that, right? But we can see that the main source of this, where all this is coming from, is because we don't want to accept that there's God. We don't want to accept that there's a controller. We don't want to accept that everything's coming from God, because that means that we aren't the supreme enjoyer. We aren't the supreme controller. And everything is not just meant for me. This is this whole problem which current society is brought up under, is that everything around me is for me. It's meant for my enjoyment, and it's meant for me to control. But if you bring the idea and the proper knowledge of the supreme controller, then one can't have all these different ideas. And like we said, we went to at least in the Western countries, I would say, is the peak of this atheism, is the peak of this so-called modern advancement. And what is it? People are more and more addicted to drugs. People are literally insane. Like we met some insane people. Like I thought people in New York City were crazy. People in Toronto are insane. And pretty much every single person that you talk to, they're either gay, lesbian, trans, non-binary, or one of the other 500 different adjectives that they've come up with now to express yourself and to figure out who you really are. This is their version of self-realization. But really, people are more unhappy, people are more dissatisfied, and people are plunging more and more into ignorance. This so-called advancement, it's not making anybody happy. It's not solving any of these problems. Srila Prabhupada said, if you're a real scientist, then solve birth, death, old age, and disease. But they can't do any of this. They can like we, Giri and I, one of our favorite sayings is, same soup reheated. And that's like basically this modern scientific understanding where they basically just represent the same thing, just sort of with a different color, a different tinge, a different twist. And they say, oh, but in 50 years, we will be able to live forever. They've been saying that for the last 300 years. So we can practically see that what's going on in the name of science, what's going on in the name of material advancement, it's just wholesale cheating. It's completely cheating everybody. And in fact, if you actually get to the bottom of it, they know that they're cheating too. They know it. They know that what they're propagating is wrong. The scientists, they know that literally the word hypothesis is just a fancy way of saying, I guess, and I don't know. But what's going on in this name of science, which is really this cheating, is just, it's like a whole bunch of like song, dance, this, that, this, the other thing, just to cover up the fact that they don't know anything. They don't know anything. And in fact, they know that they don't know anything. But the current science that's being propagated, it's just so they can exploit and control more and more people. So they can be on top, quote unquote, in this modern society. So what we should do is we should distribute all of these books to every single person. So everybody has a full set of Srila Prabhupada's books. So they don't even have to go to school. Srila Prabhupada said when he was asked, what curriculum should we teach in our gurukuls? Srila Prabhupada said, you simply give them my books. Everything one needs to know about life is there in my books. And if you really study the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srila Prabhupada has given us all of the practical knowledge that we have to know, even to live in this world. Right? Srimad Bhagavatam, it has a whole social system completely delineated and completely organized. Right? It has how to, aside from all of the vast spiritual knowledge, how to deal with people, how to do this, how to do that. So we simply have to study Srila Prabhupada's books. Then nobody has to go to this quote-unquote educational facility known as school, which is really just a prison house. So we should share with every single person a full set of these books. And then people can actually get the real knowledge. Charadeshna Prabhu?
One point just on education, just modern education. It's, I think you talked about how sometimes your parents are trying to help you. Things like this is completely different from what I learned. I guess there's some things that stay same, stay the same. But if you look at I always thought it was interesting. The textbooks are generally the same, and it was nonsense then, it's still nonsense now. The teachers are still teaching from it. You look at the PowerPoints they're using, they're recycled, and then when they do bring in new course material, you have to pay for it. On top of that, and it's learning new concepts that generally is not even being implemented in whatever field you're going into because it costs too much to even deal with. So it's just like a theory that doesn't even have any practical use anyways. So it's complete nonsense. And this is the requirement to go into all these different professions and jobs and whatnot. You're learning all this stuff that, again, like I said, you can't implement a lot of these concepts that they're talking about anyways. And I'll always see from my friends, one of them was studying some sort of engineering. And I was like, you get to this job and it's just all this stuff that I learned about for the past 2 years. I'm thinking that we're going to be using this, and it's you don't see it anywhere. So it's just what the hell was I doing?
Yeah, it's crazy. I remember my mom, she tried to help me with my math homework growing up. And then she was like showing me the way that she did it. And I was like, that's not how I learned to do it. And then I showed her the way that I learned. And she was like, why are you doing it like that? You can just do it like this and like this and like this. And I was like, I wasn't taught that way. So since she went to school in Europe, she was taught a completely different way of doing the same system of mathematics. But actually, if we look at, like I said, all of this mathematics, all of it is so much more in-depth, even if you look at the Vedic understanding. Like in the Vedas, they had this idea of zero. They had like a decimal system. Like, have you ever heard of like Roman numerals? And how like if you get to big numbers, you have basically like a whole page of just like these Roman numerals. But the I guess you could call them like Vedic scientists. they like had like they could just write it as like 10 to like the power of 12, and like they had like all of these like super like in-depth like mathematical understanding, but yet they were just savages. You know, it really doesn't make any sense at all, not at all. You know, so yeah, we should just don't send your kids to school. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, actually, don't send them to school, but.
One more thing on this modern sexuality. It's like anyways, the interesting thing is, in order to justify all these different expressions of sexuality, I'll say, one of the justifications I've heard is, oh well, the Greeks and Romans and people from however many years back, they were gay, so it must be okay, because people have been doing it, and we're doing it now. So it's like I don't see how that's like a reason. They don't. I mean, of course, we see like in the Bible, later in I think specifically third canto, like how
Yeah.
you know that whole pastime, and that these people, I guess, yeah, they had been around, but it's completely totally sinful. So without having that proper source of knowledge, it's just looked at as, yeah, this is right.
You know, I actually have a lot of compassion for these kind of people, because you can see it's really stemming from a deep desire within their heart that I don't know who I am. That this body, this family, all this that I've been given, this can't be me, right? So people who actually take up to this like craziness where they like completely mutilate their bodies, they do all this kind of stuff, it's really coming from because they don't know who they are. Which is why, again, Prabhupada's books are the solution for all of these problems, because it perfectly delineates in a way that'll actually satisfy you. Like a lot of people, they do all these surgeries and they take all these chemicals, and then 10 years later, they're like, wow, like I really wish I hadn't done that, but now I can't go back. But Prabhupada's books, it gives people the medicine they're actually looking for. It gives one the perfect knowledge by which this, problem, which is plaguing society seemingly even more now, of who am I? It perfectly addresses that. So for anybody who's under the umbrella of all the 500 different terms that they've come up with now, we should give them Prabhupada's books so they can actually be satisfied. Mataji, any questions, comments, or anything? No. Do you have anything more?
I was just gonna say, I'll never forget. I saw a video of this one Mataji. She had gone through the sex change surgery because I guess I want to say she was like 18, so like she was able to make the decision, or it was like she was deemed old enough to make the decision, so she went through with it. And she took a video of herself like a year later, and she literally looks like a 50-year-old man who's balding. She's like, I wish I knew, all these different side effects that were gonna follow, because now it's just like, I mean, I think she was a woman, she changed into a man, and now she can't even get women. So it's like, it was just like, it's like, it's all twisted, It's like, you go through all this, and you just end up creating so much more suffering. And you see, that lust completely totally bewilders all logic and intelligence.
Yeah, and we can see all of this actually stems from, in fact, Bhakti-Vikas Maharaj says like this, that all of this is actually stemming from this atheistic education. Because nobody's taught that there's anything spiritual, there's anything after this life. everything is just coming from chemicals. Everything that's wrong in your head, it's just a chemical imbalance. Like there was the interview that Bhakti Vikas Maharaj did with Vishnu Prabhu, where they were talking about psychology and everything like this. And I mean, I experienced a lot of that firsthand because I did some like clinical rotations and like psych wards and everything like that. So a lot of what he was saying, I was able to see like firsthand. But they literally think that since the brain is all just chemicals, they just change the chemicals that are in the brain, and then everything will fix itself. But you see these people, they're like zombies. They're crazy. So this atheistic education, it's actually creating all these problems because people think that this life is all in all, everything's just coming from matter. So the purpose of this life is just to try and enjoy as much as possible. That's the conclusion that one comes through with this atheistic education, which again, we have to give them the real education. Every single person that we meet, we should at least try to give them Prabhupada's books. Any other questions? Comments? Nothing? Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.